Reports had been altered after the fact in an attempt to reframe intent. There was no room left for interpretation. The commander wasn't dragged away or stripped of insignia in public. That kind of ending belongs in stories, not real life. Instead, he was relieved of command effective immediately. An official reprimand was entered into his record. His name was quietly removed from consideration for any future leadership roles. He would finish out his service in position with no authority and no visibility, his career ending not in disgrace, but in silence. That silence was a punishment. Men like him lived for recognition, for legacy, for being remembered as decisive leaders in the final chapter of the war. Instead, history would record a different truth, one without medals or speeches attached. Shortly after, notices were issued to the rest of us. All charges against enlisted personnel involved in the operation were dropped. Statements were amended, records corrected. Language that had once implied misconduct was replaced with factual descriptions of compliance with lawful orders as given at the time. No apologies were offered. None were expected. What mattered was that the truth stood. Walking through the base afterward felt different. The tension that had lived in the air for weeks began to lift, slowly, cautiously. No one celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate. Too much had been lost for that. Lives, trust, pieces of ourselves we wouldn't get back. But there was a quiet sense of validation. We hadn't been wrong to follow orders. We hadn't been wrong to speak up when those orders were used against us. The system hadn't worked quickly and it hadn't worked kindly, but in the end, it had worked. Poetic justice didn't come through spectacle or revenge. It came through permanence. The record couldn't be rewritten again. The truth was filed, archived, and preserved. Long after we were gone, anyone who looked would see what really happened. Who gave the order, why it was given, and who paid the price for carrying it out. For the first time since that night, I slept without waking at every sound. The war would end soon. History would move on. But one thing was settled forever. Obedience hadn't been the crime. Trying to erase responsibility had been. After the findings were released, nothing changed all at once. And that, more than anything, made it feel real. There was no announcement declaring a new era of leadership. No speeches about lessons learned. The commander was simply gone, his office emptied, his name quietly removed from the duty roster. In his place came a temporary command team that moved carefully, as if every decision needed to earn back trust that had been spent too freely. Briefings changed first. Orders were still firm, still urgent when they needed to be, but they came with explanations now. Intelligence assessments were presented in full, not filtered down to fit a narrative. When someone asked a question, it wasn't treated as weakness. It was treated as responsibility. At first, the men were cautious. Habits formed under fear don't disappear overnight. But slowly, people began to speak up, not to challenge authority, but to clarify it. A concern raised early saved lives later. A delay requested for verification was granted instead of punished. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Trust rebuilt in small, ordinary ways. A commander walking the lines and listening instead of inspecting. An after-action review that included mistakes without assigning blame. The kind of leadership we'd all been trained to respect, but had almost forgotten was possible. My own situation resolved quietly as well. My record was corrected. Language amended to reflect exactly what had happened. Any implication of misconduct was removed. I was allowed to continue serving without the shadow of disgrace hanging over my head. Promotions weren't promised. Praise wasn't given. But my name was clean, and that mattered more than any commendation. The weight didn't vanish. I don't think it ever could. Some nights, the memory of that village still surfaced. The smoke, the noise, the confusion. Faces I never knew, lives that intersected with ours for a single catastrophic night. Justice didn't bring them back. It didn't undo what we'd done. But truth did something else. Truth stopped the lie from becoming doctrine. It stopped the operation from being taught as a success instead of a warning. It ensured that future commanders would see the full record, not a polished version designed to protect reputations. I stayed in touch with some of the men who testified. We didn't talk much about the inquiry afterward. We talked about ordinary things instead. Home, plans after the war, what kind of lives we wanted once we were done being soldiers. There was a shared understanding between us that didn't need words. The unit carried on, changed but intact. We finished the war doing our jobs with a clearer sense of where obedience ended and responsibility began. Orders were still followed. Discipline still mattered. But blind compliance no longer ruled the day. Looking back, I don't see heroes or villains as clearly as I once did. I see systems, and the people inside them making choices under pressure. Some of those choices were wrong. Some were corrected too late. But they were corrected. The civilians lost in that village deserved better than silence. They deserved better than a footnote. They deserved the truth to stand, even when it was uncomfortable. When the smoke cleared, what remained wasn't pride or vindication. It was clarity. And in a world shaped by war, clarity was the closest thing to justice we were ever likely to get. When I look back on that time now, what stays with me isn't the fear of the inquiry or the relief when it ended. It's the lesson that obedience, when stripped of accountability, can become something dangerous. War demands discipline. It has to, but discipline without moral weight turns people into tools. And tools are easy to discard when the outcome becomes inconvenient. For a long time, I believed that following orders was enough, that doing what I was told would protect me, my men, and my conscience. I learned the hard way that obedience doesn't erase responsibility. It just shifts it. And if no one pushes back, it settles on the people least able to defend themselves. Standing up didn't mean mutiny. It didn't mean defiance or chaos. It meant working within the system, documenting the truth, and refusing to let silence rewrite history. That kind of courage isn't loud. It doesn't come with medals or speeches. Most of the time, it looks like quiet persistence and the willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of what's right. The war ended. We went home. Life moved on. But the record stayed, and so did the truth. Not as a triumph, and not as revenge, but as clarity. Clarity about where duty ends and accountability must begin. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Military Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What had been quiet pressure turned into something more deliberate? I submitted my report to the proper channels, exactly as instructed, and made sure copies existed in more than one place. Others did the same. No one announced it. No one bragged. We just started protecting the truth the only way we could, by making it harder to erase. Witnesses agreed to testify, but always in low voices and away from prying ears. Men who had survived artillery and machine gun fire suddenly spoke like they were afraid of being overheard by the walls themselves. Each one had the same fear. Not that they were wrong, but that being right would cost them everything. Command noticed. The first sign was subtle. A schedule rotation disappeared from the board. A reassignment for operational needs was mentioned in passing, always attached to the same names. Performance evaluations grew colder, language shifting from factual to vague. Words like questionable judgment and emotional decision-making began appearing where competence used to be noted. Then came isolation. Men who had been reliable team leaders were suddenly excluded from briefings. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the tent. A rumor started that those involved in the operation were unstable, that the stress had affected their perception of events. It was character assassination without paperwork, the kind that couldn't be formally challenged because it was never officially written down. I was called into a meeting and told, not unkindly, that my future assignments depended on my flexibility. The implication was clear. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant disappearing into some forgotten corner of the war effort, or worse. Despite all of that, the paper trail kept growing. Each statement reinforced the others. Timelines overlapped. Accounts matched in ways that couldn't be rehearsed. The original order surfaced, its language unmistakable. The absence of evacuation instructions was an oversight. It was explicit. The destruction of radio transcripts, once a rumor, became a documented fact through multiple testimonies. Then the twist came from a place none of us expected. An intelligence officer, frustrated and nearing the end of his deployment, brought forward classified assessments that had been quietly sidelined before the operation. Those files painted a very different picture of the village. No confirmed enemy presence. No active resistance cell. In fact, there were reports suggesting the area had already been cleared days earlier. More damning than that was a notation attached to the commander's briefing request. A deadline. A window to secure the route before a scheduled visit from higher headquarters. The operation wasn't about neutralizing a threat. It was about optics. A clean map. A decisive action. Something that could be reported upward as progress in the final phase of the war. That single discovery flipped everything. Suddenly, the men who had followed orders weren't liabilities. We were evidence. Our actions, brutal as they were, matched the instructions we'd been given perfectly. The contradictions weren't in our reports. They were in command's attempt to rewrite intent after fact. The pressure intensified, but it lost its edge. Threats sounded hollow when weighed against documented proof. Reassignments were delayed. Conversations grew more careful. The tone shifted from accusation to containment. For the first time since the operation, I felt like we weren't just reacting anymore. We were pushing back the right way. Not with anger or defiance, but with records, witnesses, and patience. The system that had been used to shield the commander was now being forced to look at him. We didn't celebrate. We didn't even talk about it openly. But in quiet moments, when no one else was listening, there was a shared understanding. Once the formal inquiry was announced, the entire base seemed to hold its breath. Orders came down, changing nothing and everything at the same time. Operations continued. Patrols still rolled out. Briefings still happened. But beneath the routine, tension threaded through every interaction. Conversations stopped abruptly. Names were spoken carefully, if at all. Everyone knew an invisible line had been drawn, and no one knew where it ran. I received my notice to testify 3 days after the inquiry was made official. The paper was plain, almost indifferent, but my hands shook when I read it. My name was listed alongside ranks far above mine, officers, staff personnel, and the commander himself. Seeing us on the same document made the stakes suddenly very real. This wasn't just a review anymore. It was judgment. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said higher headquarters wanted this buried quietly before the war ended. Others said examples were about to be made, and it wouldn't be the ones wearing stars. Every version sounded possible. That uncertainty was the worst part. I slept in fragments, waking at every footstep, every door opening in the night. Every knock felt like it could be someone coming to escort me away. I replayed the operation over and over in my head, questioning every decision, every order I'd passed down. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew the truth didn't always win. Testifying was nothing like I'd imagined. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just quiet questions asked in neutral tones, designed to peel back layers without revealing intent. I stuck to facts. Times, orders, movements. I didn't speculate, and I didn't defend myself beyond what the record already showed. When the commander testified, the atmosphere shifted. He spoke with confidence, carefully measured, emphasizing the fog of war and the difficulty of decision-making in combat. He didn't deny issuing the order. He reframed it. He suggested discretion that hadn't existed, flexibility that had never been offered. Listening to him, I understood how easily the story could still turn against us. Careers hung in a balance, not just mine. Men who had trusted me to pass down lawful orders now faced scrutiny because they'd done exactly that. The weight of that responsibility sat heavier than any accusation. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the hearing adjourned. No conclusions were announced. No hints offered. We were told to return to duty and await further instructions. Days passed, then weeks. The silence was absolute. That quiet was more terrifying than any threat. In the absence of answers, imagination filled the gaps. Every delay felt intentional. Every unanswered question felt like a decision already made somewhere far above us. We went about our duties, but nothing felt normal. We were suspended between outcomes, waiting to see whether obedience would be punished or whether the true TH would finally be allowed to stand. The end didn't come with an announcement over loudspeakers or dramatic confrontation. It arrived the way most real judgments do, quietly, unmistakably, and final. I was in the motor pool when word started to spread. Not shouted, not even spoken aloud at first. Just looks exchange, a nod here, a whispered confirmation there. The findings had been released. Later that day, I was formally notified. The language was precise, almost clinical. The investigation had concluded that the original orders existed exactly as described. Written directives had been issued. Radio communications supported their execution. Intelligence assessments contradicting the operation had been known and deliberately sidelined. I gathered my men and passed the order down exactly as it had been given to me. My voice sounded steady, even though my hands weren't. I told myself I was doing my duty. I told myself the intelligence had to be right. I told myself that command saw something we didn't. Those lies were easier than admitting I felt powerless. We moved toward the village under cover of darkness, boots sinking into wet ground, weapons held tight. The plan was vague because the order was vague. Secure meant clear. Clear meant whatever was necessary. Radios crackled with fragments of updates, none of them helpful. Shadows shifted between buildings. Someone fired a shot. I still don't know who fired first. From there, everything collapsed into chaos. Gunfire echoed through narrow streets. Shouts in languages I didn't understand cut through the noise. Fire started almost immediately, spreading faster than anyone expected. One building caught, then another, until flames jumped from roof to roof. The smoke was thick, blinding, and full of screaming. Civilians poured into the streets, confused and terrified. Some ran toward us, some away. In the dark, it was impossible to tell who was a threat and who wasn't. Orders were shouted, contradicted, repeated. Men tripped over debris. Weapons discharged in panic. Training kept us moving, but it didn't give us clarity. I remember pulling a young soldier back by his pack just as he raised his weapon toward a figure stumbling out of a doorway. I remember shouting commands I'm not sure anyone heard. I remember the sickening realization that control had been lost, and no amount of discipline could bring it back. By the time the sun started to rise, the village was unrecognizable. Smoke hung low over blackened ruins. The roads were littered with debris and bodies we didn't yet know how to account for. Whatever enemy-present intelligence had suggested was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Command radioed in shortly after sunrise. The operation was declared a success. The route was secure. The objective achieved. There was no mention of casualties beyond vague references. No questions asked. For a brief moment, it seemed like that might be the end of it. Another brutal operation, in a brutal war, filed away and forgotten. But within days, the tone shifted. Higher headquarters started asking for detailed reports. Civilian casualty estimates. Clarifications about engagement rules. Suddenly, the same commanders who had emphasized speed were emphasizing restraint. Words like context and judgment started appearing in conversations where they hadn't existed before. The written order was no longer described as clear. It suggested we might have misinterpreted intent. Briefings became colder. Questions were directed downward, never upward. Names were requested. NCOs, squad leaders, anyone close enough to take the fall. Rumors spread quickly. Courts, tribunals, careers ending in disgrace. No one said the commander's name out loud anymore. When I was asked to submit my statement, I wrote exactly what happened. I described the order as it was given. I detailed the lack of evacuation instructions, the pressure to move fast, the chaos on the ground. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften it. A day later, I was pulled aside by an officer I trusted just enough to listen to. He told me, quietly, to choose my words more carefully next time. He said there were bigger forces at work, and that honesty, while admirable, could be dangerous. That was when I understood what was happening. The first crack didn't come with confession or a dramatic reveal. It came quietly, buried in paperwork. I was still working on my statement when I noticed something didn't line up. Times were off. Movements that I knew took hours were compressed into neat, impossible blocks. Radio check-ins I clearly remember were missing entirely. At first, I wondered if exhaustion had warped my memory. We were all running on fumes, after all. But the more I compared notes with other reports, the clearer it became that this wasn't sloppiness. It was deliberate. I started keeping copies of everything I touched. Orders, summaries, after-action drafts, anything I could get my hands on. I didn't know why yet, only that something was being reshaped, smoothed down until it no longer resembled what actually happened. The story was changing, and it was changing fast. One night, long after lights out, a soldier I trusted approached me outside the tents. He spoke in a low voice, glancing around before every sentence. He told me he'd kept the original written order, the one delivered before the operation. He hadn't meant to at first. It had just ended up folded into his field notebook, forgotten in the chaos. When he heard how command was now describing the order, he realized that piece of paper mattered more than anything else he owned. A day later, another man pulled me aside during a supply run. He admitted the commander had ordered him to destroy radio transcripts from a night of the operation. Not summarize them, not correct them, destroy them. He'd done it. Because refusing wasn't an option, but the look on his face told me it had haunted him ever since. That was when the pattern snapped into focus. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It was a controlled retreat from responsibility, and we were being positioned as the buffer between command and consequences. Around that time, a senior officer temporarily attached to our unit requested to speak with me. He wasn't part of our chain of command and never pretended to be. His reputation had preceded him, not as a climber or a hero, but as someone who took regulations seriously, even when it made people uncomfortable. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't promise to protect me or make things right. He simply asked me to walk him through what happened, step by step, without emotion or speculation. When I finished, he nodded once and asked if I had documentation. I told him what I had, and what others had quietly admitted to keeping. He explained something that no one had ever spelled out so plainly before. In wartime, orders are binding. You don't get to debate them in the field. But responsibility doesn't evaporate as it moves up the chain. If an order is given, it exists. If it's written, it leaves a trail. And if it's altered after the fact, that alteration becomes its own violation. He told me that documentation mattered more than intent. Witnesses mattered more than reputation. And silence, while often safe in the short term, almost always guaranteed the wrong outcome in the long run. For the first time since the operation, I felt something shift inside me. Until then, everything I'd done had been about staying afloat, protecting my men, my career, my chance to go home someday. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about whether the truth would survive at all. I started speaking more carefully, not less. I made sure dates were exact, times precise, names accurate. I encouraged others to do the same, without pressuring them. Everyone had to choose their own risk. The story was still being rewritten, but now it had resistance. Small, quiet resistance, built from folded papers, whispered admissions, and one officer who cared more about integrity than advancement. Once the statements were formally requested, everything moved faster and colder. The rain had turned the airfield into mud, and I could feel it soaking through my boots as I stood outside the temporary command building. Armed guards lined the entrance, rifles held tight, eyes fixed anywhere but on me. Inside, I could hear raised voices, officers arguing behind closed doors. I already knew what this was about, not because I had disobeyed orders, but because I had followed them exactly. I was a junior noncommissioned officer, barely seasoned, sent to execute a direct command during a chaotic operation in the final months of World War II. The order was clear, stamped and delivered without room for debate. Carry it out, or face a court-martial for insubordination in the middle of a war. We followed that order. By dawn, an entire village was gone, civilians caught in a decision made far above our pay grade. Now the war was nearly over, and command needed someone to blame. The same officers who gave the order were rewriting reports, scrubbing timelines, and preparing to sacrifice the men who carried it out. On paper, the orders were lawful. In reality, they were unforgivable. So I'll ask you the question that changed my life forever. What happens when obedience becomes a crime? If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Military Update. And tell me in the comments, where you watching from? I need to rewind a few weeks to explain how we ended up there, because nothing about that night came out of nowhere. I was stationed at a fictional Allied base carved out of what used to be farmland on the edge of occupied Europe. We called it a base, but it was really just a sprawl of canvas tents, half-buried bunkers, and mud roads reinforced with scrap wood. By that point in the war, everything felt temporary. Buildings, plans, even lives. I was a junior non-commissioned officer, responsible for a small group of men who were as worn down as I was. We'd been rotating through operations non-stop for months. Sleep came in short bursts. Meals were rushed or skipped. Intelligence reports changed faster than the weather. Every mission was labeled urgent. Every order non-negotiable. The pressure never let up, because command kept reminding us that the war was almost over, and that somehow made everything more dangerous, not less. Everyone wanted to be the unit that delivered the final blow, the commander who finished strong. Back home, I had a wife and a young child I'd never held. Letters were my lifeline. I reread them until the paper nearly fell apart, memorizing the handwriting, imagining normal life just to keep my head straight. When things got especially bad, I'd write back even if I didn't know what to say, because putting words on paper reminded me I was still human, and not just another piece of equipment. That base had seen a lot of commanders rotate through, but the one in charge when this story begins stood out. He was a decorated field commander with a reputation that followed him everywhere. People said he got results. That phrase came up constantly, in briefings, evaluations, even casual conversations. At first, I believed it was a compliment. He spoke confidently, carried himself like someone who'd survived things most people couldn't imagine, and he had medals that proved he'd been in the thick of it. Early on, most of us respected him. He didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess himself, and didn't tolerate inefficiency. In a war zone, that kind of certainty can feel reassuring. But over time, small things started to feel off. Orders came down faster, with less explanation. Intelligence summaries were shortened or selectively emphasized. Civilian presence in operational areas was dismissed as background noise. When someone raised concern, the response was sharp and public. Nobody wanted to be the next example. The first warning sign for me came during a routine operation review. A squad leader mentioned civilian movement near a supply route we were planning to secure. The commander cut him off mid-sentence and told him that hesitation cost lives. He didn't shout, but his tone carried a clear message. After that, nobody brought up civilian concerns unless they were explicitly ordered to. Dissent didn't disappear. It just went quiet. Conversations shifted to whispers inside tents, or looks exchanged during briefings. Everyone felt it, that tightening in the chest when you knew something wasn't right, but couldn't quite prove it yet. The war had taught us to trust orders, because second-guessing could get people killed. That lesson had been drilled into us from day one. Then came the briefing that changed everything. We were packed into a low-ceiling command tent, maps spread across a folding table, rain tapping against the canvas. The commander pointed to a small village marked near a crossroads. According to him, it was likely harboring enemy remnants. The intelligence was thin. Intercepted chatter, unconfirmed sightings, nothing solid. Someone asked whether civilians had been evacuated. The commander didn't answer the question directly. He said the village sat on a critical route, and that any delay could allow enemy forces to regroup. He emphasized speed and decisiveness. Treat it as hostile, he said. No hesitation. I remember the silence that followed. No one spoke, but everyone understood what that meant. Another NCO cleared his throat and asked if we were authorized to proceed without further confirmation. The commander stared at him for a long moment and then said that cowardice had no place in the final stretch of the war. That was a line crossing, even if we didn't name it at the time. From that moment on, the room felt different. The order wasn't illegal on paper. It was framed carefully, wrapped in urgency and authority. But it ignored everything we'd been taught about proportional response and civilian protection. Still, refusing it would mean immediate consequences. Inspections, charges, career-ending marks on our records. In wartime, those things could follow you for life, if you survived long enough to see the end of the war. As the briefing ended, the commander reminded us that history favored the decisive. He said hesitation cost lives and obedience saved them. We filed out quietly, boots scraping against the muddy ground, each of us carrying the same unspoken thought. The order came down just after midnight. There was no build-up, no discussion, no room left for interpretation. A runner handed over the written directive, and I read it twice to make sure I wasn't missing something. Secure the village by any means necessary before dawn. No mention of evacuations. No requirement for confirmation. Speed over certainty. The words were clinical, almost attached, as if they described the rain instead of people. I remember folding the paper slowly, buying myself a few extra seconds to think. Everything in me said this was wrong. Not illegal in the way we've been trained to recognize instantly, but wrong in a way that sat heavy in my chest. The kind of wrong that doesn't go away just because someone with more rank says it's fine. I looked at the other non-commissioned officers. We exchanged quick glances. Nothing more. No one spoke. In that moment, silence wasn't agreement. It was survival. Refusing the order would have meant immediate arrest. Disobeying the field during wartime wasn't just career-ending. It was life-ending. At best, you'd be disgraced and removed. At worst, you'd be made an example.